So finishing off chapter 23 today. Like last lesson, it's a fairly straightforward and simple passage. And so it's verses 23 to 35, okay? Ending of the chapter. Centered around the kind of conclusion to this Jerusalem affair, as it were. So, Acts chapter 23, verses 23 to 35. And when he called to him two of the centurions, he, referring to the tribune, said, "Make ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to proceed to Caesarea by the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to put Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter having this form: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their Sanhedrin. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. And when I was informed that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to speak against him before you. So the soldiers, according to their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, 'I will give you a hearing after your accusers also arrive,' giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium." Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So as I mentioned, this is a fairly straightforward passage, and it's largely just some historical details that give us some context as to what then occurs over mainly the next chapter. Today's the last lesson for this proverbial term, and we'll pick up again a week or two after Easter, once I return. So that'll flow us through to having finished this portion of the Jerusalem affair, and then things start moving forward over these last few remaining chapters, only a couple of chapters to go now. So, verse 23. And when he, in reference to the Roman tribune, called to him two of the centurions, he said, "Make ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, i.e. cavalry, 200 spearmen, Pelium or Pelus, the spearmen, to proceed to Caesarea by the 3rd hour of the night." So the 3rd hour of the night, if some of you may know this, some of you may not, and that's fine. The days and the nights being measured by the sun, of course, as is the vast majority of human history, including us today. 6 p.m. is generally how it was essentially rounded, what we would call 6 p.m. today. Was the beginning of the night, right, with the going down of the sun. Most human cultures throughout human history have not been obsessed with seconds and milliseconds like we are, so rough time estimates.
What time night did you say it was?
6 p.m.
I thought the night started at 6 p.m.
That's my point. The night starts at 6
so
p.m.
it would have been 9 p.m. for them. It was.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, so I'm talking about when the night starts.
Yes. Yeah.
At 6 p.m.
Right.
The daytime then starting, of course, 12 hours later at 6 a.m. Yeah.
That's a lot of people to get together to.
Yes, it's essentially the whole Roman cohort, and there probably was more than one cohort. There would have been more than one cohort in Jerusalem. An entire legion was assigned to the province of Judea. There would have been most likely a cohort, maybe a cohort and a half here in Jerusalem, another cohort to a cohort and a half perhaps in Caesarea Maritima. I'm guessing here because we're not told specifically. And then maybe the kind of fourth and a couple of other cohorts then spread around Judea. You would have had.
That's a lot of provisions you've got to keep supplying and wages.
Yeah, exactly. My estimate's probably too low there though. I'd say probably 2 to 3. You've got 10 cohorts essentially, roughly per legion, right? I would estimate that there's probably three cohorts in Jerusalem, another 3 cohorts in Caesarea, and then the remaining kind of 4-ish cohorts around Judea from there, the province. Yeah, around other cities and big or small and spread out.
How much on average were they paying per soldier?
This early on in the Principate, I'd need to have a look. It's less. Well, it's not a flat equation. So there are pay increases do come in later under various emperors for various reasons. But at the same time, across that period when pay increases come, there are also times in which currency cutting is occurring. So currency cutting is basically a kind of quasi-inflation in a sense almost.
They're printing more money.
Yeah, and so cutting currency is where you then take, we kind of do it today. We just we just put up with it. But your $2 coin is not actually $2 worth of gold, because there's also basically no gold in it. It's aluminium, it's nickel, it's copper, etc. Blah blah. Depending whether you're talking about gold or silver coins.
It's not an IOU like the original currency.
No, and you also can't. It's also not redeemable for anything. So it's pure fiat currency. Yep. So you can't redeem it for gold. So it's the worst of all possible systems. But nevertheless, that's
especially to the gold bullion sellers. Oh no, you need to go buy gold bullion. The coin's worth nothing.
Well, they're correct in that respect, at least fiscally speaking. So currency cutting is where you then take an ancient currency. Let's just say it's made out of silver, and you then start melting it though, where it's maybe 95% silver but 5% nickel, and then so its actual value is less, or you actually start literally cutting, which is where that term comes from. You actually start shaving off clipping it. Yeah, exactly.
Well, the Spanish had pieces of 8, which was a single piece cut into 8 pieces.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's where that comes from. Yeah.
And Sydney, we actually punched holes in our coins because he physically ran out of coins.
Yeah, exactly. Correct. Yes, and so that's where that comes. And so when you have pay increases over the coming centuries for Rome, there's also money clipping and cutting going on, and a bunch of other things. So there are a couple. There are emperors who were killed by the Praetorians over that very issue. The Praetorian Guard being the imperial guard of the Caesars. About half of the emperors were assassinated, mostly by the Praetorian Guard, in the history of the empire, and many of them were assassinated over fiscal policy or monetary issues like that. So what they were specifically getting paid, it's less than they would. Well, I don't have a specific number, but it was certainly less than what they'd be paid. There are pay increases that will come, but also at either concurrent or near times, there's also dodgy monetary policies going on here, especially if you're an auxiliary as opposed to a Roman as opposed to a citizen soldier. Nevertheless, a cohort goes here. Again, I'm guessing here because I'd have to. There may be historical data on it. I'm not sure if there is, but I would guess that there's probably 3 cohorts or so in Jerusalem, 3 cohorts or so in Caesarea, and the other 3 to 4 or so around Judea. So he sends an entire cohort here. Is essentially what this is, broadly speaking.
The actual spearmen, the Roman spearmen, the spears they used were very nasty little pieces of equipment.
By design, yeah.
Because they were soft.
Yes.
So
they could move through flesh much easier.
Oh, they'd also bend once they got in, hit bone, and
yeah, they splinter. Yeah. So they come at the 3rd hour of the night. So he doesn't hesitate. He doesn't wait till the next day. He sends them off at basically 9 p.m. Okay. Provides mounts, horses, to put Paul on and carry him to Felix the governor. And he then writes this letter to him. So we now get the name of the tribune. I hinted at that in previous weeks. Claudius Lysias, who is the tribune in question that we've been kind of interacting with as we've been going through this last couple of chapters. We know obviously about him basically primarily from the New Testament itself. I'd explained before how the senior officers of a Roman legion worked, but he's one of those senior figures as a ruler of 1,000, as it's referred to, the Chiliarch, using the Greek term. He's then writing to Antonius Felix, who is the governor of Judea, the Roman province of Judea at the time. He is a praetor, and technically, in terms of at this particular juncture in history, called a procurator. There are different terms and titles used for the governors of different Roman provinces, depending on which time you're talking about. Obviously, Pontius, he's in the same office that Pontius Pilate.
Okay, I was about to ask that. Yeah.
Yes, they just are operating by different terms and titles.
But he's not based in Jerusalem like Pilate was.
Well, Pilate technically wasn't based in Jerusalem. He was in Jerusalem at that time.
Right, okay.
Caesarea Maritima still had always served as the provincial capital of Judea, over there on the coast, and was the second largest city behind Jerusalem in the province. So it was Jerusalem, Caesarea Maritima, that is, which he is just being referred to in shorthand as Caesarea. There was a praetorium or a palace, and I'll explain what that means by the time we get to the end. In Jerusalem, that's where the encounter between Christ and Pilate would have occurred there. So basically, the governor's palace is what the praetorium is. There's also, of course, a major one in Caesarea, which is where we're headed to here. But yes, and Antonius Felix was governor in the form of a procurator at this time. Different titles come for different reasons. Sometimes the titles are military titles, sometimes they're judicial titles, sometimes they're administrative titles. Again, it just depends on how different times the Romans kind of shuffle the administrative chessboard. Here, though, during this time, they're called the procurators. He was procurator from 52 to 60, and we're about 58 here at the moment, so we're toward the end of his reign, or his rulership. Not a particularly nice man, according to Tacitus and other Roman sources. Quite a licentious, brutal, and lustful man as far as Roman records are concerned. But nevertheless, receives Paul, though, in a fairly professional manner, to his credit. So this is what Claudius Lysias, and there's something else. Well, keeping in mind, Claudius, this is an interesting dynamic. Claudius Lysias, who we've seen this in previous chapters, he mentions to Paul that he had to purchase his citizenship, and I've explained before that he was Greek, he wasn't Roman. Interestingly enough, about Antonius Felix, he was actually born a slave. Ended up being freed and eventually worked his way up the proverbial administrative or governmental totem pole. Ended up becoming a governor of Judea, which is probably as high as you would expect someone to reach, I suppose. He's the governor of a backwater province.
Still, it's a pretty long haul that he's done from slave to governor.
Correct. And so, yeah.
Or procurator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, the governors go. Yeah, so procurator, governor. Those terms. The governors go by different terms at different times. So governor is what he is, and as a procurator. But he didn't. When I say that he was a slave, he had come from certain stock. Certainly. He was actually descended from the Greek kings of Arcadia, which is a region in the southern Peloponnese, in the middle central Peloponnese. But so that's probably part of the impetus. But nevertheless, circling through here, the most excellent governor Felix. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was Roman.
Yeah, not quite in that order.
He's not completely fibbing. He's not. He's certainly not blind. Lying in a completely overt fashion. He's just whitewashing it a little bit. So when this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, so I came up to the troops and rescued him. That did happen at the temple, right? Having learned that he was Roman. That didn't quite. It didn't quite. Well, you learned that he was Roman after you'd already bound him, but that's a whole other issue. So
and was about to whip him too.
Yeah, correct. So this sort of happened. This did happen with an asterisk, and wanting to ascertain, verse 28, and wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their Sanhedrin. That did happen, and I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Again, that's true, and that's also a basically picture-perfect description of exactly what happened to Jesus himself. In regards to Pontius Pilate, which is what I pointed out in previous weeks, is that this whole Jerusalem affair very closely mirrors what happened with Christ. Accused under matters of the law, but actually not being able to be found guilty of anything deserving death, let alone imprisonment, let alone death. But yet, nevertheless, the Jews still trying to kill him anyway. None of that's a coincidence. It shows, and I pointed out in other weeks, so I won't go deep into it again. The most obvious evidence of their lack of repentance is the fact that the exact same thing that they did to Jesus, they then attempted to do 30 years later to Paul, in almost play by play, in many of the exact same places. By the way, literally the same places, the same Antonian fortress, the same temple court, the same prisons, etc., etc.
Probably the same priests.
Some of them, at least, yeah. The high priest was different, but certainly many of the Sanhedrin would have also been part of that as well, if they were younger. And so, but nevertheless, pointing out that nothing deserving of death or imprisonment. But to give Lysias credit here, to give Claudius Lysias credit here, he didn't just hand Paul over to the Jews, as did Pontius Pilate. He actually did better than what Pilate did. So to give credit where credit's due. The key difference, though, is that Jesus was not a Roman citizen, Paul was, and so that's the impetus for that. But nevertheless, in verse 30, and when I was informed that there would be a plot against this man, right, referring to the assassination plot, which we covered last week, which we saw in the last lesson, Paul's nephew overhears this, reports to Paul, reports it to the centurions, reports it to Lysias, etc., etc. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to speak against him before you. Okay, so in essence, this is him. This is a very typical structure of a Roman correspondence. The introduction of the man, the person writing, then addressing to the recipient in an honorific form, especially if they're more senior hierarchically. Greetings. That's very, very common, and then a synopsis essentially of what the events had occurred. And so when we talk about the New Testament, especially the Gospels and the Book of Acts, serving as a historical source, this is what we mean. This letter is structured exactly how, all the other kind of letters we find from Roman history are structured. And it's not, this letter's not recorded elsewhere as far as I've been able to ascertain. But it doesn't need to be because it's recorded here. This is the historical record of it.
What would they have written it? What would he have written it on? I mean, how easy would it that been to preserve? Was it vellum or? Certainly wasn't cuneiform on clay tablets.
No. This would have been written on parchment of some kind.
Okay. I'm surprised that they actually kept all these sort of letters and documents to this day that we could see.
We don't have this specific letter today in terms of the actual.
You said there were other ones. Though.
Oh, I mean the other ones. Yes. They're always fragmentary, basically, because it depends on where. Certainly, though, in this part of the world, it's a lot easier to keep. more desertous, more barren and desertous landscape, drier, so not wet, not soggy, no bogs and wetlands for bacteria and other such things to corrupt paper and parchment with. So the dry desertous sands actually are perfect conditions for preserving things. That's why so much of the broader kind of eastern Mediterranean, south and southern Mediterranean has so many of those things have been preserved. Some of the best copies of the scriptures are from that part, because unlike Europe, which is rainy and soggy and cold, these drier, hotter places where there's no moisture that can, corrupt the documents.
I know. I was simply saying I'm surprised that something as minor as just a letter from one Roman to another.
They certainly don't come in isolation. They come during. They're found if and when they're found in the context of broader archaeological digs of a town or a city, and so then you're digging, and then you dig up an administrative building like a praetorium, and then in the praetorium you find
all this stuff was
fragments of
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was the governor and I saw this, right in the bin, let's see.
Yeah, but like today, like we did today, it's not how many letters or even soft copy of things, of emails and other such things, go through every single arm and branch and office of the governments of Australia. All those are,
and that's all recorded.
All those are sitting on files in servers wherever. And so all those correspondences, they're all kept in that respect. If Rome was anything, it was by comparative standards, an efficient administrative machine. So that synopsis is not wildly untrue in verses 27 to 30. It's a very clean version of what we've seen. That's why it's interesting that the fortunate thing is that we can then read the work of Luke, the historian here, who's gathering together eyewitness evidence and a whole host of other things, talking to people. Hey, what did you see this? Blah, blah, blah. He's talking to the apostles. He may have talked to Roman soldiers who'd been there, who knows? And fills in those broader pieces of context, and then we can actually see how the proconsul Claudius Lysias recounts this compared to what we've seen. Obviously, it's a synopsis, so it's not like he's going to go into detail here in a letter. This is just meant to update the Governor Felix on what's broadly gone on, right? It's not designed to be in depth. And so that's why, for example, some have questioned, is this the entirety of that letter, or is this just like an abstract from it? Is it a synopsis? It doesn't much matter, because it's entirely possible that it would have been this length, because it's not designed to be a play-by-play recounting of every single... No, exactly. That's all it is.
Just an introduction.
Yeah, it's an update. And a Roman governor doesn't have time to sit down and read a 100-page document on this one single incident, right?
Well, our directors and that don't do that now. We call them TLDRs, or cover pages.
Yeah, exactly, correct. Yeah, exactly, cover page. It's an abstract. So, verse 31, the soldiers, according to their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Antipatris, a city basically between Jerusalem and Caesarea. It's maybe, I don't know, I want to say about 40 to 50 kilometres, maybe northwest of Jerusalem, maybe here to Penrith away, roughly speaking, Katoomba to Penrith away. Long story short, it's on the journey. It's on the route you would take from Jerusalem to Caesarea. It was built by Herod the Great in honor of his father Antipater, hence the name Antipatris. But nevertheless, they stop off there. They bring him by night, so they travel through the night to Antipatris. Then the next day, so basically through that morning, right, the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they return to the barracks. So essentially the legionnaires and the spearmen, once they've gotten out of the city and the surrounds of the city, where massive amounts, where millions of people are for Pentecost, they've gotten to Antipatris, they feel confident enough that now an attack on Paul or an ambush is unlikely.
How far away was it?
Antipatris, yeah, so I was saying about maybe 40 to 50 kilometres away.
Okay, all right, so it's not that far away.
Yeah, but far enough away.
But they were able to do it overnight, what gets me.
It's basically here to Penrith.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe.
Still a pretty fast march.
Yeah, but they can cover that through the night, through the morning. Again, we're not giving specific. It's just but the next day. So at what point that is, we don't know.
I'm just looking at the practicality. I mean, I've had to walk distances myself, and I know that just how far you can cover in a few hours.
Well, the Romans, different armies in the ancient world had different strengths. One of the things that made Rome very difficult to beat was the fact that they were by far the best pack marchers, as we refer to it. They were the best force marchers in the ancient world by a country mile. And so half the time they'd beat enemies because they would just beat them to the battlefield. They'd beat them to the battlefield. And so by beating them to the battlefield, they were then able to do set up and establish exactly where they wanted to on the battlefield before the enemy even arrived at the battlefield.
Yeah.
And at that point, if they had the high ground, you've already lost the battle before you even arrived.
So it's a major strategic advantage for you as a
Correct.
As a country.
Yeah, it's mainly what made them so terrifying. They could the distances they were able to cover just put their enemies at such a distinct disadvantage, because you would account for how quickly they could move, and they would move much quicker than what you'd accounted for.
So can I just clarify? So if they were going, say, from here to
Penrith,
how long would it take them?
Well, they've covered this through. They've headed off at 9 p.m. They've covered through the night, so that's at least you're talking at least 9 hours. And then it just again doesn't give a specific time. It says the next through the night. But the next day, so like at what point in the day we're talking about now, we're not told. But either way, we're talking. They've punched that out in
I know you can do
9 to 12 hours at the minimum.
Yeah, you can do about 4 kilometres in about 40 minutes. So that's about a kilometre every 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yep. Basically. The 10 minute kilometre is a fairly standard. Fairly standard number, even for regular infantry. Generally, you'd want them to be faster than that, though.
I think force marches, they average 14 kilometres or something.
Force marches can be much quicker than 10 minutes. There are units today even that would want to do a kilometre in 9, 8. But nevertheless, so the next day, leaving the horsemen, so they leave the cavalry. Right, they leave the cavalry section of the within the cavalry unit. They send back the legionnaires, send back the spearmen. They don't need them anymore because now any issue the cavalry are going to be able to deal with anyway because they're mounted, which is half the thing. Paul's on horseback anyway here, and so it's just now a cavalry unit that's moving with him.
Plus, just with the horses, they'd move faster. They'd cover the distance they need to a lot.
Correct.
Faster.
Yeah, the whole cohort there was to basically protect him as they were getting outside the city and the surrounds. Once they arrived at Antipatris, they were safe, and they could then just carry on from there. They returned to the barracks, i.e. Jerusalem. Verse 33, when these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when he had read it, when the governor Felix had read the letter, he asked him from what province he was. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, which we've seen before, so Cilicia is from specifically the city of Tarsus in the region of Cilicia, in purple for anyone who has their map there, up near Antioch on the right side. Antioch, yep. And then you see Cilicia around the bend, as it were. That's where he's from, Tarsus in Cilicia. Pardon me. That's it. So when he learns he's from Cilicia, he says, "I will give you a hearing I'll give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium." So he verifies that he actually is a Roman. That's when you're reading between the lines, that's what he's doing there. He verifies that he really is a Roman. They'd be conversing in Greek here. And he then, confirms to him or informs him that he'll establish a tribunal to then hear the matter between Paul and the accusers, right? So that's what I was saying. So essentially here, this issue could not be resolved in Jerusalem. It's not going to be resolved here either, but I think coming chapters. But it couldn't be resolved in Jerusalem. Claudius Lysias, as the highest ranking official there, has then kicked it up the bureaucratic chain, as it were, to a higher authority, namely the governor. And he would then be held in the jail in Herod's Praetorium. Praetorium, named after one of those positions of praetor, which is what governors have been referred to, like along procurator and other such titles as that. A praetorium was basically the governor's palace, right? So it was a Roman administrative building. You'd have quite large, 2 stories at the minimum. Most of them, as far as I'm familiar with. You'd have offices there, people working in, people coming and going. You'd have documents like these coming in and out. And basically, a praetorium was where the governmental administration would occur. It was essentially a government building, like Parliament House in Sydney or down in Canberra and whatnot. And so that's where he'd then be held out of jail as well. Because sometimes Roman governors would also be magistratus or magistrates, although at different times magistrates would be their own official position separate from the governor. Again, it shifts around depending on what time of the empire you're talking about. But nevertheless, magistrates could also hear cases in praetoriums as well. And so you would have a jail complex in any praetorium to then hold prisoners in, to then bring them before the governor or before a magistrate or before some government official, if that makes sense. And so Paul's going to be here for a while. As we see in the next kind of coming text or coming lessons and chapters when we start moving through, he's here in the prison in the praetorium of Caesarea for I think about 2 years. It says in chapter 24 or 25, I think chapter 24. But this certainly though is the I suppose the conclusion to this whole Jerusalem saga that we've been going through in the last kind of 2 chapters. We've seen him arrive at for Pentecost to then have maximum exposure. He is then he arrives in Jerusalem. He's greeted by James and the others. He is then we then had the incident, as it were, with the four Christians there in the church who had taken the Nazirite vow. He then manages the situation diplomatically by going to the temple with them and having them complete the rite, which involved sacrifice, but guides them along. So we talk about Paul being callous and hardened before the lesson began. That's him being very much not callous and hardened, because he's not callous and hardened. That's him making the best of a bad situation, and trying to help some young wayward Christians through a dumb decision that they made. Well-intentioned as it would have been. They then you then have, of course, him in the temple complex, but then the Jews mob against him, throwing out all kinds of accusations. A number of the Jews who had been assailing against him in Asia, right? We're also now in Jerusalem, obviously, as well for the Passover. So these long-standing nemeses of his were there, and they picked up where they left off in Asia. He's then beaten and dragged and almost killed, except for the Romans saving him. You then have the back and forth between the barracks and the Sanhedrin, then of course the assassination plot, which we saw in the weeks prior, last week, and then here we are now concluding this all. All in fulfillment of exactly what, as we saw, if I go back up and find it, verse 11 of this chapter, when the Lord stands by his side. So verse 11 of chapter 23. When he's still imprisoned by the Sanhedrin and by the Romans and awaiting. The Lord stands by his side and says to him, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly borne witness to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must bear witness at Rome also." And as I explained back then, that was the alleviation of any concern that Paul would have had about him meeting his end in Jerusalem, which is probably what he did expect. He expected probably to be killed in Jerusalem, to die there. That was God very much confirming to him that that would not occur. And part of this we'll cover when we get to the end of the book, obviously. He's still got another 10 years left in his life. We're at about 58 here. He is martyred in about 68. And so, that's the ending of this chapter. When we come back after the Easter break, we'll then pick up obviously in the beginning of chapter 24. Any questions or comments? No? All right. Very good. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Very much.
Yeah, so I said these two passages are, there's no, they have content, but this one today is just, this is one of those, it's filling in the historical context. It's serving as a transition between what we've been going through with Jerusalem, more specific details, some of the deeper theology things, and then what comes up in the coming chapters. And so it's serving as any good historical story does. It fills in the blanks and has transition points, and this is just one of those. So I won't waste your time with rambling on about things that are not all that terribly complex. But yes, after Easter, you should all now have schedules, I believe.
Yep.
Okay. And so then just follow along with that. Can't remember what the date specifically is, but a fortnight or 3 weeks, whatever it is, after Easter, when I come back from a break. So I think 3 weeks away. So not next week, not the week after, but I'm pretty sure the week after that. But anyway, long story short, just check your schedules, they're correct. And we'll go from there. And so then we'll begin chapter 24. Right? Cool.
I've got another question, just not to do with Acts at all.
Sure.
In Genesis, and with Joseph, and he's being promoted under the Pharaoh and that stuff. Do we know who that Pharaoh is? Or have you got an idea?
Ramses the third, or
No. The Ramses come on. The Ramses are the 19th dynasty, much later. The Ramses are in the 14th and 13th centuries. We're talking about 19th century hero. If I'll go back and look. The interesting word, I just need to remind myself. Give me a minute or two. While I find what I'm looking for, part of the difficulty in Egyptian history is, well, there's many difficulties in Egyptian history.
There's a lot of sense.
There's many different.
They actually took a lot of writing off the. They censored a lot of stuff.
Correct. Yes. So Egyptology, in all of academia, and this is not for anyone familiar with the field, they'll know what I'm referring to. In all of academia, irrespective of any discipline you want to talk about in any department, in any field, in any university in the world, if any discipline falls into the definition of a cult, and a kind of academic cult, it's Egyptology. Egyptology as a field is, it's fairly modern. Obviously, it's a field of the last kind of 150 to 200 years. It's absolutely dominated by a very, very well-established kind of academic dogma about a whole host of things concerning Egyptology, especially the timing of things and the king lists. And more importantly, any academic who ends up coming along who then either then finds new source material or new evidence basically has to go through an entire consortium of gatekeepers to even begin to try and challenge the established narrative. When I say challenge, I don't mean like with wild-eyed speculation. I mean like with legitimate, verifiable, basic academic integrity and rigor. it's a very, very weird academic discipline. If you're not familiar with it, it may seem odd that I'm mentioning it in that way. But if you're familiar with it as an academic field, it's very, very, it's an extremely strict club, and anyone who contradicts the currently established dogmatic understanding of, say, the king lists, would literally in certain places would lose grants, would lose positions, would lose, etc. Which is ironic because it's also very widely understood that the Egyptian king lists are detailed, but are detailed by ancient Egyptians for ancient Egyptian purposes. So, for example, if you read the history of ancient Egypt, you would think that these guys were the greatest warriors in the history of the world because they virtually never lost a battle. But they did.
They obviously
They did because their enemies say they did.
Yes.
But as far as the Egyptians are concerned, they didn't lose because when they did lose, they just didn't record it.
Well, that's the same with the Jewish Exodus.
And this is exactly correct. That was the segue I was about to make. This is a segue I was about to make.
Yes.
So one of the prevailing, and this is my point about academic dogmatism, and the refusal to change based on new evidence. Right. That's my whole point for tongue-in-cheek saying it's a cult. Is that the defining argument among atheists as to why the Exodus didn't occur is because there's no evidence of it in Egyptian history. But that shows someone who doesn't understand Egyptian history, or someone who hasn't studied Egyptology, and someone who's not familiar with it. It actually shows a lack of knowledge of ancient Egyptian history, because the ancient Egyptians never recorded losses, virtually never, even though we know that they did. So their losses to the Assyrians, so when you fast forward all the way down to the 8th century, for example, right, so the 700s through the 600s, but the Egyptians get crushed by the Assyrians, right? So they get absolutely crushed by the Assyrian Empire. You wouldn't know that though if you just read the Egyptian annals, right, the Egyptian records, because they just don't record it. Even though everyone else in the world does record it. The Assyrians record it, the Babylonians record it, the Bible records it, right? So the Hebrews, right? Everyone else records it. The Egyptians don't. So as far as the Egyptians are concerned, they didn't lose to the Assyrians, and it never happened, right? It's the same. It's like what happened. It's like what happened with Chernobyl back in the 80s, whenever it was. The Soviet government, when that happened, and I'm not exaggerating when I said this happened, the Soviet government came out and said that when the world, because obviously they're trying to keep it heavily under wraps and they're trying to keep it secret, which was a difficult job to do, obviously, as toxic fumes are spewing over into Poland and everywhere else. The Soviet government came out and said that no, this is misinformation. This is just Western propaganda. There hasn't been a nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl because nuclear meltdowns don't happen in the Soviet Union. Because we say so. Nuclear meltdowns don't happen in the Soviet Union, therefore Chernobyl didn't happen, right? So and human beings, which is what we do this on things that seem like trivial. We do this on things that are super macabre. Venezuela fixed its infant mortality rate by outlawing the ability of doctors to report deaths in hospitals.
I think all countries at some point.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and so Venezuela's infant mortality rate is stellar because they made it illegal for doctors to report infant deaths in hospitals. So of course, do you see what I'm saying to you? So the way that history gets recorded, this is why Egyptology is kind of a bit of a cult. And so when a king did or didn't reign is also based on a whole bunch of inferences. You're working back from more certain dates and filling in the blanks, right? Because the date, it's not like every single date is, and this king began his reign at 9:27 a.m. on the 30th of March in the year. No, it doesn't work that way. It also ties in with elements of the blending between blunt fact versus religious or mythological accoutrement. You see this in, for example, the ancient Akkadian king lists, which are very old, the Sumerian king lists of Babylonia, ancient Babylonia. where you have kings reigning for 36,500 years.
And you think that's totally bogus?
Well, it's not a question of it's not even a question of bogus. Those kings did reign. It's a failure to understand why they recounted those numbers. The Sumerian king list are all their reigns are for like thousands and tens of thousands of years, but it's a failure to understand that those numbers, they're not concerned with the literary, the literal number, the literal timing accuracy. Those numbers are symbolic. Special numbers, yeah, they're symbolically special numbers. And that's fine because it's just differences in culture. Especially post-Enlightenment with our modern kind of atheistic secularism, symbolism's out the window. We're purely analytical, purely...
So things where it says in the Bible 40 days and 40 nights doesn't necessarily mean 40 days and 40 nights.
It doesn't have to.
Yes.
I would argue it does in those certain circumstances. And how we treat numbers is, again, this is my point about context, is there are plenty of instances in the scriptures where the numbers are absolutely direct and literal, and there are other instances where the context determines that they're not. And that's not a problem, because it's only a problem if we assume that the Bible has to be using numbers how I currently use numbers in the 21st century.
Yeah, interpretation. Yep.
Yeah, interpretively, right? So the issue is not actually with the text, it's with an interpretive problem. So, point being, on the king lists, there are kings where we know that a king was there, but we don't even know their name.
Because it's totally been blotted out.
It's correct. It's all kinds of things, and so
they found walls where you could see they chiseled off all the.
Oh, correct.
Records.
Exactly. Yes. And so exactly correct. And so there's a whole host of complexities, but yes, Egyptology is a shockingly dogmatic field with no warrant for being anywhere close to that dogmatic. To try and get you to a close answer of when on earth. What king that may or may not have been, what pharaoh. I'm now fast forwarding to. It certainly would have been. It's during what we call the Middle Kingdom period, but it would have been. I need to see how far the 11th dynasty. No, it's probably into the 12th if I can find it. Yeah. It's most likely during the 12th, what we call the 12th dynasty. There's 20 odd dynasties by the time you roll your way all the way through Egyptian history, which goes on for thousands of years.
You would have thought there would have been some fairly extensive, remarkable records kept of the plagues and the death of the firstborn throughout the kingdom. I mean, that would have been stuff would have been recorded.
That would have been a failure.
You would think, though, because except the problem is that the Egyptians, based on how Egypt acts, have every... This is my point earlier. The fact that the Egyptians record they do and they don't. So one thing which we know happened in the I'm using rough numbers here, mid 15th century, so basically the transition between the 18th and the 19th dynasties, is there was a massive famine. That's well established by other nations around, those in Canaan and the Assyrians. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because Egypt has always been the breadbasket of the Middle East, historically speaking, right?
Still is to this day.
It's certainly in many respects, exactly, yeah.
And is that what's happening in the whole Joseph? That's what's happening around that?
Well, no, I'm referring to the plagues that come in the time of Moses, sorry.
Moses.
Yeah, sorry. So the locusts and famine and everything else, right? So there is a famine recorded around that time in broader ancient Near Eastern history, right? Which does line up with what you see in the Exodus, with a famine happening through one of the plagues, right? Egypt has obviously on the Nile, in and around the Nile, has very good farmland and fertile land. Not many. Iraq's not known for its farmland, which is where Babylon is.
Canaan seem to have a lot of famines.
Yeah, because Egypt had famines.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the modern idiom of America sneezes and the world catches a cold. Mm. In the ancient world, Egypt sneezes and the ancient Near East catches a cold. Certainly obviously in the scriptures, which specific pharaoh it was is not actually recorded. But again, that's not terribly uncommon either. Documents in the ancient world just simply referring to the king of Babylon or the king of this without mentioning his personal name is not something that's uncommon at all. So it's not like the scriptures have done something unique per se. They've actually written it just as many other documents in that time are written. it has been inferred, and I think it's a reasonable inference that that not mentioning the pharaoh's name is basically kind of a put down of just referring to him as Pharaoh, that his personal name is irrelevant, whereas God's mentioned all the time, God, blah blah blah. Or in the case of the immediate context that we're talking about here with regards to Joseph, that God's man Joseph is mentioned, but the enemy of God's not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Other than titularly, right? So in regards to his title. Nevertheless, we could estimate based on these kinds of things. We could estimate when that is, again, depending on which scholars you want to talk about, because there are scholars who date things early, there are scholars who date things late, just like with the Exodus itself. Historically speaking, you have the majority of, if and when people ever talked about the pharaohs, it was the prior prevailing thought was during the 15th century BC. Later on, by the time you get to kind of the late 1700s, certainly through the 1800s and the 1900s till now, those dates were largely shifted forward in time to more around the time of the 20th dynasty and onwards. So figures like Ramses II or Ramses the Great doesn't quite stack up with the evidence.
No.
There is some things that could point to it being a later date, but not really. But it's the same prevailing. My primary issue is not that. My primary issue is with the fact that the same scholarship which wants to date it under Ramses the Great is the same scholarship which basically wants to say that the entire Old Testament was written either during the Babylonian exile or after the Babylonian exile, which is just not
It's just making it fit in with their...
correct. It's not. It just doesn't fit the evidence at all, because you have things in Genesis where the language in Genesis, especially Genesis 1 through 11, the language being used there is extremely old. There are phrases that are used there which we only find basically from kind of the 16th to 17th century BC and before.
Have they found any fragments of the Old Testament that are that old, or?
The oldest fragments that exist in terms of the actual documents themselves that are extant today. The oldest are among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the oldest
That's way past.
Oh wait, yeah, no, way past, yeah. No. Expecting all those things to, again, that's just not how. Nothing from those times survives. Or anything. Even if I just talk about the Egyptian king lists, we don't have it's all copies of copies.
Okay.
Which is, again, that's perfectly normal. Again, if that was ever a complaint, which it is, plenty of people have complained. An argument that atheists have made as well. How do we know what was originally written when these manuscripts come, hundreds of years after the gospel, but to failure to understand how the ancient world worked? It's not.
And
it shows a lack of knowledge, not as opposed to their professed knowledge. The oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have are basically 22 to 2300 years old, right? Things like Isaiah, for example. But even that, we're talking about transmission now, I suppose. Prior to the 20th century, the oldest manuscript of Isaiah, seeing as I mentioned that, I'll use that example, was from 1000 AD.
That's pretty new.
Right? So Isaiah is alive in the late 8th, early 7th century BC. You're talking about 1 3/4 millennia later, is when the oldest manuscript that we had up until the 20th century. And then overnight, we go from 1000 AD, we then discover almost entirely complete, basically an entirely complete manuscript of Isaiah from somewhere in the Hellenistic period of maybe 200 BC, plus or minus, maybe plus, but 200 BC. And so overnight, we jump 1200 years in the manuscript evidence.
But they found that the accuracy was, they just shot that argument down.
It was exactly the same.
Yeah. That's identical except for very small things.
Basically, you're completely identical except for minor spelling mistakes,
Yeah.
which means nothing. And so the manuscript, what that means is...
But it hasn't stopped people saying, oh, it's all Chinese whispers, it's all been
No,
fabricated.
that's just,
Even though now the evidence is right.
very, very uneducated argument. No. So going from 1000 AD as the oldest manuscript of Isaiah that we had to 200 BC, so a 1200 year jump in terms of the comparative manuscripts, right, the copies of the originals, and they're identical. And like the notion of questioning then the veracity of the scriptures is just hilariously laughable. There's no after the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's no argument left at all. Well, there wasn't an argument before, but there definitely isn't an argument now. That jump is literally unprecedented. It's unique. It's never happened in the history of recorded history of writing.
Right.
Ever.
It is
Nothing has ever gone a 1200 year jump in basically 24 hours, and the documents are virtually exact. They're literally identical.
And who knows?
How do they date the manuscripts?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways of how you date ancient things. Some methods more reliable than others. The best evidences are comparative. So, for example, you establish a group of things for certainty using certain techniques, and then you can measure other things off of that. So, for example, when you look at, one thing that's easy to do with language is looking at what a language actually looks like, right? Over time, languages develop and evolve, right?
There's a name for that.
Yeah.
I don't remember it, but I know there's a particular name for that science of actually looking at the evolution of language and then working out its age.
Yeah, well, it's everything from orthography to a whole host of other fields that kind of fall under that banner. Yeah, but you go back 1,000 years, and we're speaking Old English, and then we move through the periods of Middle English. We then move, and all those have different subsections, and then we're in modern. We're in a particular subset of Modern English, as we refer to it, right? So someone trying to read Shakespeare in Middle English, well, Shakespeare's actually technically in early Modern English, but someone trying to read Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is in Middle English, that you can make it out, and if you know a little bit of Middle English, you can definitely read it. But then someone trying to read Beowulf from Old English, if you don't know Old English, you're not going to have blue's clue as to what that's saying. And so I can read Middle English fluently. I can make my way through Old English, sort of, kind of, to a degree. I can kind of read Beowulf, but not really. So that's the same thing in Hebrew.
When was Beowulf written, roughly? Do we know?
Well, Beowulf is a northern European story of Germanic origin that again evolves over folk in a folk context over time. So it's kind of like asking, well, when was Beowulf written? Well, Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon accounting from the 8th century? No, 9th century. 8th century? 9th century? I have to go back and look. 8th or 9th century. Anyway, the early medieval period. That it itself is drawing from that story, which is older. Just like Hamlet. Hamlet is just drawing off this concept of Amleth, which is the original kind of Danish or Scandinavian story. And so there's this transmission of similarity, right? So when it was originally came into being, well, it's probably way older than that as well. But yeah, when things get written down as stories, that's another question. But yes, Beowulf is early medieval period of the 8th century, whatever it is, 7th century.
But there's so many different types of dating. Like, for example, we can do really accurate dating from anything from the 1950s onwards.
Correct.
Because of the atomic bombs.
Yes, correct. Yes, exactly. Yes. So using atomic methodologies are something that's then available. On the literary side, this is actually partly my point to come back to your question on regards to the age of certain of different books in the scriptures, is that not just the manuscripts, but then actually looking at how they're structured syntactically. In other words, what's the grammar of the sentence? How is it structured? The word order, blah blah blah. That changes over time, right? So the way that I'll take a phrase from ancient texts like Beowulf. That was good kinging, meaning that was a good king, right? So if I say that now, that was a good king versus that was good kinging, very different. You can hear similarities, but they're two different things. The other one sounds like Ooga Booga Caveman because it's not a full, nice, illustrious, complete sentence. That was a good king, that was good kinging. That was good king, right? It's different syntax. So you can see that scripturally as well. So the way in which, and it just, if you on the level of scholarship. So there are a number of things in the Old Testament, especially as I mentioned in the book of Genesis, which are very, very old ways of phrasing a sentence, including actually many of the idioms. So I've pointed out one classic example is in Genesis 3. I can find the verse, but long story short, where God says to the ancient serpent, "You shall be cast down upon the earth, and you shall crawl upon your belly upon the earth all the days of your life."
14.
Yeah, I'm bringing it up now. Yeah, yes, you're right. So this verses 14 and verse 14, yeah. And the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this," right, and to see blah blah, "cursed are you more than any of the cattle, more than any beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and the dust you will eat all the days of your life." Going on your belly and eating the dust, which is what those phrases are. Eating the dust is a phrase that we find in ancient Near Eastern texts going back 4,000 plus years. Right. Among the Sumerians, for example, the Akkadians. So, for example, in the ancient founding mythology of Babylon, the Enuma Elish, you have the story of Marduk, the national god of Babylon, the hero of Babylon, who becomes their national god. So when you hear making sacrifice to Marduk in the Old Testament, that's who it's referring to. The foundation of the world to the Babylonians was done by Marduk slaying Tiamat, the chaos goddess, is this serpentine dragon figure, and by slaying her and then forming the world out of her remains and etc., basically creating humans from the earth as slaves to help him fight Tiamat, blah blah. Tiamat in that story is then condemned to eat the dust of the earth. The exact same phrase, right? On your belly to go, the dust you will eat all the days of your life. It's this language, it's this very, very ancient mythological language of a divine being, in whatever culture we're talking about, being cast down from the heavens, a phrase which maybe you should recognize from here, about someone being cast out of heaven. And then actually being, the dust of the earth is to then be sent beneath the earth, into the underworld, right? So cast from the highest places of the heavens into the worst places even beneath the earth, right? On your belly you shall go, right? So the lowest possible position, right? Bowed down, prostrate, and eating the dust of the earth is to then, it's this concept of death and destruction, right? That's a very short synopsis. It's much more complex than that, but that's the short version. So that phrase in verse 14 is astonishingly ancient. So the notion that that was written in like the 6th century BC is beyond laughable to anyone with genuine scholastic knowledge of the ancient Near Eastern world. Only someone trying to basically turn this into pure mythology and nothing but fiction because of their ideological beliefs, atheism, only that kind of person would ever come up with that idea, right? That's just one example of many, many examples. That's why, irrespective of anything else, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are older than the rest of the chapters. And that's evidenced by things in them.
I mean, we've been using carbon-14 dating, which naturally occurs in the atmosphere and then decays in any carbon.
Yes, that's a scientific method you can use. But
it's been renowned for being quite inaccurate in longer distances. But they've got
it's a much problem as soon as you get out to certain.
They've got a new dating that they've recently discovered called luminescence dating.
Yes.
Which is basically any group of minerals, they can date how long that it's been since that mineral has been exposed to light.
Yeah. Exactly. It's similar to those things like radiocarbon dating, of which carbon-14 is a thing. Carbon-14 dating has been very heavily relied upon. I think overly relied upon.
It was only done in the 1940s that they discovered they could do it.
No, I know, but our modern you're correct. Yeah, all radioactive datings of those kinds, radiocarbon datings. But our modern arrogance, we've presumed under ourselves a level. It's kind of what I was talking about with those who want to date the Bible to like basically all that's written during the exile or after. It's just nothing but hubris. It's complete arrogance of thinking that, oh no, we figured it out, even though it's astonishingly obvious that these things are much, much more complex, like with the Egyptian king list. Like, so I can give you a rough estimate that this happened in the transition between that and the 19th dynasty in regards to the Exodus, for example. But what specific, it also doesn't matter, but which specific pharaoh was ruling at what specific time?
Considering we still don't know the names of some of them.
Some of them, yeah. It assumes that we know exactly. And all the dates are filled in from ones that we do have a very good idea of what we know, and then you backfill or front fill. But that's not a complete, that's not a foolproof way of fooling it. It's the same thing with with dating of certain things using scientific methods like radiocarbon dating. You can get some pretty reliable dates from those things, especially things in the last kind of couple of, last 2,000 years, for example, 3,000 years, 4,000 years, etc. But beyond that, once you start stretching it out beyond really like 4,000 years, it's just not reliable because it's so. You've already starting to reach the threshold of its half-life of carbon, and at that point, so then when you come out with trying to carbon date things that are purported to be 50,000 years, it's just ludicrous.
That's where the luminance dating comes in a lot more.
That's my point about exactly, and part of that too is failing to is the necessity of acknowledging that there are hosts of assumptions that have to be worked in, and those assumptions might be valid, but they are also assumptions. So it's my whole point about like with the Egyptian king lists. Working from dates that we do know and then filling in ones and trying to then backfill as a result of that might be accurate. It also might be an incorrect assumption because that's my whole point about our hubris. We just blindly assume, in modern academia in the West, we ironically assume that our assumptions are accurate.
But you can't have that.
Oh, I know, but we do it all the time. It's all the time we do it. We do it in all kinds of fields across various different departments and disciplines where the assumptions that undergird many peer-reviewed papers and studies are just laden with assumptions that everyone just agrees to collectively assume is true, and no one ever really actually asks whether that assumption is true.
Like that bridge incident in Baltimore. The assumption was we don't need tugboats to take a large container ship underneath the bridge.
Yeah, right until one loses power and careens right into it and kills God knows how many people now.
It's the whole issue of the age of
Sure, yeah, cosmogony and that's what I try to explain to people even before beginning a discussion on it is there is a host of assumptions that have to be made to even begin to draw an answer of any kind. Large numbers, smaller numbers, there's really no in between, I suppose, but larger or smaller numbers, and even as to what those larger numbers or smaller numbers even are, contain within them a host of assumptions which might be true. They also might not be. It's the inherent nature of an assumption. Assumptions at the end of the day are, at best, calculated a priori, essentially conclusions that you're drawing beforehand. It's working knowledge. We're gonna operate off of this a priori. In other words, prior to the fact, a priori knowledge. We're gonna say this is how we think this developed, and let's start working from there. The problem is that requires humility, which we are largely lacking. And
mind you, I mean, assumptions aren't all bad. You wouldn't be able to communicate or be able to do any sort of transaction.
Absolutely.
If you didn't have a certain basis of assumptions that you both knew.
Correct. And that's exactly my point. Actually, I made this point when we were talking about, for those who were here during the sermon, on not bearing false witness against your neighbour, the ninth commandment. My entire premise during that sermon was historically in the West, and rightfully so, and fortunately so, throughout the last 2,000 years of Western or European history, there has been the ability and the environment in which to assume that people are operating broadly or even directly on Christian principles and ethos and concepts and blah blah blah. What their personal faith in that thing is maybe depend on 1,000 different factors, but nevertheless there's a set of assumptions that are able to be worked, and the chief example of that I used in that sermon was it's the second paragraph, but the main portion of the US Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life lived in the pursuit of happiness. Now, what the rest of that means is an entirely different historical question. But the beginning of that concept, of that axiom in American history, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The problem that then comes, and the Americans started finding this out about 5 minutes after the Constitution, after their nation was founded through the Constitution in 1789, that by the time you get to the early 1900s, even in America, those things are not self-evident to everyone. Right? And so what happens when these truths that might be, because I don't think they were, but maybe, even if I just assume, well, actually they kind of were, that these truths are self-evident to you, what happens when they're no longer self-evident to people? Because they've abandoned the Christian religion, they've abandoned this, they've abandoned that. The entire point that I made during that sermon is that this is the problem we have at the moment. We can't even, when reading the Ninth Commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. We can't even agree on what the definition of false is, what the definition of a witness is, and what the definition of our neighbour is.
Yeah. I mean, look,
none of those things.
Yeah, that the Earth is spherical should be self-evident, but we've got people around here who insist that it's flat.
Yeah, so there's a host of different beliefs and things that are, and so exactly. And the point I was making during that, because I was talking much more deeply about the very nature of truth, is that these things are actually not. They're inherently true, because that's the nature of that's their ontology. That's how they are by nature. Truth is true, irrespective of how we perceive it. That's the major problem with yes, correct, because of the objectivity. Yes, these things are. So every human being could die right now and be gone, and so no thinking mind from a human perspective in the world, and 2 + 2 would still equal 4.
The sky would still be blue.
Yeah, all these things would still be factual, right? Because these abstract truths, because they're all abstract. Well, I know we say 2 + 2 = 4, but ultimately we're taking an abstract concept that this many combined with this many is the exact same quantity, hence equal, as this many. This is just a physical manifestation of the abstract idea. Or I can write 4 lines, like a Roman numeral. Or I can put a bunch of sticks together. Or I can get 4 of these objects and go 1, 2, 3, 4. This many, that's 4, right?
You
but
can
these are
go
abstract
this
concepts.
many and this many equals this many if you're in binary.
Yeah, good point. All these things are true because they're actually independent of the human mind. But they do have to exist in a mind. They're not material, which is part of the evidence of God. They must exist in some other mind, not ours. That's the key problem with the Enlightenment, was the fact that Christians across Europe, especially in the aristocracy and in academia, assumed, erroneously, that they had arrived at these conclusions through their own human reasoning. That's the whole elevation of reason and rationality in the Enlightenment. That's why then the French, when they overthrow Louis XVI, oust the monarchy, destroy the church, well, they attempt to destroy the church, the cult, Maximilien Robespierre's cult of reason becomes the state religion of France for 5 minutes.
It was a sociology thing too. I mean, they wanted to create a whole new society.
A whole new way of being man, right? Equality, fraternity, liberty. But all of this was born out of the problem in European society, well, upper echelons of European society in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, but particularly the 17th and 18th, that these various things being true were true because we had arrived at these conclusions with our own cognitive abilities. except they're not, because what it did is it absolutely and utterly, it didn't just fail to account for, it did fail to account for, and it abandoned the idea of, and the reality of original sin. That actually no. These things are self-evident, but not to us, because through our sin we have been corrupted and we've been cut off from God, and we've been given over to it. And this is all of exactly what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, that though perceiving the evident truth of God, I'm paraphrasing, the evident truth of God, the evident reality of God, the thing from that which has been made, they have nevertheless, talking about the pagans, right? They have nevertheless turned themselves over to images of animals and of this and of that, right? The material credible. So it's not self-evident at all. No, our mind is actually we are actually enslaved to our vices, right? And we actually need to be redeemed from that. So the entire gospel was basically watered down, if not entirely abandoned, among European academia and aristocracy. And so that's the idea that then prevailed. This is what then happens where these truths, and so as a result then, apostasy occurs and those truths are no longer self-evident, right? So assumptions work in an environment where people are of the same culture, the same religion, the same ethos, blah, 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 and they therefore operate under certain parameters, right? Anyone who's travelled around the world, widely or broadly, realises that a whole host of Western assumptions about what is even thinkable conduct, even in public, flies right out the window as soon as you step on the plane, right? You can go to places in Africa or in Asia where things are done routinely that literally boggle the Western mind, that we don't understand. And vice versa, yeah.
Australians that go to Bali and walk around half naked everywhere, and
Yeah.
they're like, well,
That's
who
got
are
to
these
be
people?
that's got to be offensive to.
Well,
you
it's
know.
offensive to anyone, quite frankly.
Well, it is offensive to anyone, but it would be offensive, yes, also to the.
They're very conservative. There's-
Bali's an interesting mix. It's obviously Indonesia's Islamic, but Bali's got a very strong Buddhist subsect to it. But
It's
yeah,
got quite a big Christian
it does.
community as well.
Yeah, certainly comparatively in Indonesia. But yeah, there's a whole host of. I've explained this thing before, and I'm just using one example here because it goes in all kind of different directions. You can read of obviously, like, say, I'll take one example, like with France. So France has had massive amounts of immigrants move into France in the last 10, 15 years, particularly from West Africa.
Well, they had their colonies there, so
Yeah, I know that's part.
they
Yeah,
were pretty much French citizens.
yeah, no, exactly. That's part. That's why it's that region specifically.
Yeah.
And you then have scenarios where, say the unfortunate, and this is not all of them, I'm just talking about some people, where then you have scenarios where a French woman gets gang raped, for example. And then the French police are then interviewing the assailants, and the assailants genuinely they're bewildered. They don't understand what they've done wrong.
Yeah.
Because routinely in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the rape of women it's not just normal, it's just ubiquitous, it's universal. There's no concept of a man not just being able to at the drop of a hat take a woman and use her for his own purposes and ends. That concept doesn't prevail in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Parts where Christianity has been at work for the last 200 years particularly, those things have been driven out, but plenty of parts where it's not, that concept doesn't exist, especially in parts like Niger and northern Nigeria and other parts where Islam is dominant. That concept is not understood, right? And so we hold these truths to be self-evident, that men shouldn't rape women or vice versa. That's very much not self-evident in a whole host of places in the world, right? This is my entire point about assumptions, is that we as human beings make assumptions about things all the time, but the problem is we don't think deeply enough, and we don't realise that assumptions only work, just to your point, in specific environments where everyone actually agrees on the fundamental premises in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? It's exactly why, like, you've got scenarios in the scriptures where one of the common, again, atrociously ignorant arguments made by LGBT people, for example, of of Jesus never even mentions homosexuality, and because of course he didn't, because 2,000 years ago in Judea, no one was confused about this subject.
And it's in the Bible with Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah, it's in the broader scriptures, exactly. So Jesus did actually say it, but that's in terms of when they say what they mean in the Gospels, because everyone was already on the same page. No one needed to.
That's
no
sort
discourse.
of cherry picking, though, really.
Well, of course it is. That's what they're doing, exactly. But the notion that Jesus never specifically mentions the word, arsenokoites, which we translate as homosexuality accurately, and he didn't address the topic, and therefore it's actually all good with Jesus. No. He also didn't address the fact that water's wet, and that the sun rises in the east.
I think wasn't there a lot of I could be wrong here, but in Greece there was a lot of men would often sleep with men. Is that not a
Common misnomer. That's the.
I could be wrong.
That's okay.
That was an assumption.
For good reason. No, for good reason. For good reason. The common misconception
Like
is
Alexander the Great, wasn't he kind of nut?
no meaningful evidence of that.
Even though one of that TV series.
Oh, Netflix.
implies
It's
he had a close friend that they were more than just.
No, that's a dumpster fire. That's an absolute dumpster fire of it. Anyone. That's the thing. That's the thing about being wrong. Just to be blunt here for a second, when you attach your name to something that's so wildly and flamingly wrong, especially in the modern era of the internet, where everything is forever, that will live on forever with your name as a scholar of ancient Hellenistic of Hellenistic Greece. And you attach your name to that absolute dumpster fire of a documentary. No, I could be wrong. No, the common assumption is that the Greeks were very sexually flamboyant, and basically that ancient Greece was just a perennial Mardi Gras parade. That's kind of the very modern view. No. If anything, ironically, actually, it was the opposite direction. If anything, actually, the Greeks were more sexually strict than their neighbours. Yeah, that doesn't mean that there wasn't, but again, that depends on. It's all comparative, right? So compared to the Hebrews, sure they were more sexually licentious, but compared to even many of their other neighbours around east or west in Greece, same with the Romans as well. They were much more sexually dogmatic about what is and isn't appropriate. The Germanic barbarians, for example, in the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe, anything other than monogamy is almost unheard of. The concept of a man having more than one, so polygamy in other words, which we see all around the ancient Near Eastern world, the Babylonians, the Egyptian, polygamy was unheard of in Northern Europe. So the ancient Germans, the Scandinavians, the Anglo-Saxons, right, had no concept of anything other than one man and one woman. They were shocked when they learnt that other people had this kind of custom of having multiple husbands or wives.
There's a couple of incidents where people are having concubines and.
Well.
Yeah, well, that's
Abraham was.
In the ancient, that's my point about the ancient Near Eastern world. Exactly, yes. Abraham taking Hagar was not uncommon at all. He shouldn't have done it. That's not, and the scriptures are pretty clear about that. But for a host of reasons, primary of which was actually the whole promise through Sarah. But that's actually the main part. But him having Hagar as a concubine that's my whole point about the ancient Near East, was not even remotely uncommon at all, especially not for a tribal chieftain, which is what he is. Again, Abraham's functionally a king in that context. It's he and hundreds of other people who move across with him, raise whole family, blah blah blah, and many others. He raises armies. He's a tribal warlord. He's a chief, right? That's what he is. Though, functionally a king. Him having concubines in the ancient Near Eastern world is not even remotely uncommon at all. But then again, obviously, God's people are called to be set apart from that, right? So it doesn't excuse it; it just puts it in context.
But Leah and Rachel, they got married to the same dude as well.
Yep, because I'm saying to you. Yeah, because I'm saying to you about context. That's why knowing context is important, because in the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, right, the ancient Near Eastern world, as it's called academically, these things were not uncommon, right? and so all these things are kind of relative. So in regards to the Greeks, no, ironically, the Greeks were actually much more. The image of them being completely like these massively sexually flamboyant people is such a wildly novel idea. No, it's super novel. Yeah, it's really just kind of perpetrated by people who, on a general level, just hate Western civilization. That's really kind of what it is. No, a lot of the source material, a lot of the ancient source material, not only does it not show that, if anything, it's either neutral or even kind of leans toward the opposite of certainly of, and again, not that they weren't concubines, not that there weren't
Prostitution.
all those things. There was temple prostitution, right?
Yeah.
So my point about, it's not like, so I'm saying about comparative, right? But yeah, compared to some of their neighbours, they're actually probably more likely, more sexually rigid than flamboyant.
So,
Yeah.
so is homosexuality like a recent development in worldwide society? I mean, or has it always been?
No, it's depending on the culture.
And as a generally accepted thing, practice to do. That's what I mean. There's always your aberrant. Sort
Culture to culture.
Yeah.
So places like Sodom and Gomorrah, that's even in the ancient world, that's a culture that's gone off the rails, even compared to their neighbours at that time, which is kind of the point. That's why they get destroyed.
Yeah.
The judgment comes upon them, and rightfully so. Cultural differences are dependency. As a general principle, no. This is why among the Greeks, men being with men was considered effeminacy, which is very much a no-go. This is my point. If anything, the vast majority of the evidence is neutral, and if anything, the evidence is actually that they were more rigid than their neighbours, which is something about the whole Greek sexual flamboyancy thing is such a wild misnomer.
So
The
what
Romans,
you-
the mixed.
what
I'll give you
you've
one
been
example.
saying is like in the recent history, as in these AD and even a bit BC, homosexuality just wasn't a cultural norm as it is like
At no point in history has homosexuality, would any serious scholar ever be able to call it the norm, outside of singular places, regions, or cultures at certain and only at certain times.
Okay.
So, like with Sodom and Gomorrah, or like, for example, it's pretty reliably reported in the first century that during the Jewish Roman War and the destruction of Jerusalem, that in that kind of 3.5 years, roughly speaking, between 66 to when it's been then destroyed in 70, about halfway through 70 AD, that Josephus and other sources report, who again a lot of them are eyewitnesses like Josephus was, that among the Zealots and the Sicarii, so the Jewish fighters, rampant homosexuality, rampant transgenderism. The Zealots would dress up as women, and act and live as women, so they could move more freely. Not just for that reason, but because not just that reason. There were open air brothels, as in like out in public
You've got
open air
like
brothels.
the island of Lesbos, which was supposed to be.
Correct with that, and it's partly mythologized in one sense. The island of Lesbos, or Lesbos, is where the name lesbian comes from, in the Aegean Sea, and it was meant, and so did that exist at a certain time? Yeah, maybe. The further back you go in Greek history, the distinction between history and mythology gets a bit blurry. But especially in some of the Greek Isles. So to say that, for example, to say among the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, that they had a long-standing and thriving homosexual community, that's rubbish. Of course they didn't. At that time, when they've fallen into absolute debauchery and degeneracy, and the judgment of God's being poured out upon them in the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century, all the guardrails fly off, and you've got open air brothels, you've got sex just literally in the street, orgies in the streets, you've got rampant homosexuality and transgenderism, dressing up as women, the hair, the wig, makeup, perfume, the clothes, and then assassinating people in the street as roaming as hordes of women. Just wild stuff, dude. Super wild. All of that recorded by Tacitus. Also actually pointed to in the scriptures, by the way. That's how you make sense of some of these weird things. You get these figures of, I'll find it for you while I'm talking. I need to find what chapter it is. let's just say 6 forward.
Because the assumption has always been, like prostitution, homosexuality has always been around and has always been common. That's the assumption that we
It's
get.
been around. I don't think it's been common.
No, as I said to you, at no point in human history could you ever call it
That's why I'm asking that.
normal
Yeah,
or
yeah,
common.
yeah.
So if I took the Romans I'll use the Romans as an example because they're very similar to the Greeks. Not exactly the same, but they're very culturally similar. So to say that homosexuality was common among the Romans would be a gross misnomer. It also depended on what kind of definition we're using. So, for example, among the Romans, I'm not trying to be too graphic. I'm trying to water it down. So between men and men, the man on the receiving end was automatically considered effeminate, soft, womanly, for obvious reasons. The other man, if he was a Roman citizen, could not do that to a Roman citizen, and that would be punishable by death
Oh, right.
as rape.
Wow.
To a non-Roman, though,
To a slave or whatever.
yeah, different ball game,
Okay.
right? So this is my point about cultural. So Roman men having sex with Roman men never happened.
Okay.
Right? So to then say this is my whole point about the cultural delineation. We get into definitions, right? So Roman men with Roman men, illegal, punishable by death in certain contexts, right? Roman men with a non-Roman man, different ball game, depending on. Generally, it was basically carte blanche. It was basically free reign to do what you wanted.
Okay.
Because I'm a Roman, because you're a Roman and he's not a Roman.
Yep.
And so it's all good, right? But Roman with Roman, no,
Yep.
no.
Okay.
Same for the women, right? No, big no. And so then, how do we then? What assessment do we draw about homosexuality among the Romans? Well, depends on what limit or scope we're talking about, because on a very legitimate level, homosexuality between Roman men was illegal.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm saying too. So it's like, it's the same as and it's the same with monogamy. The Romans were entirely monogamous. One man could have one wife. That's it. He may have many mistresses, but he only has one wife, right?
Also, he could do whatever he wanted with his female slaves as well. So.
Correct. Yes. And so this is my point about that's now a social or class distinction. I want to point out one thing, because I was touching on it, I found the passage. It's in Revelation 9, and it's why historical context helps illuminate a more figurative and symbolic book that's heavily laden in very important symbology like Revelation. One of these, this is the trumpets of God being blown, right? The judgments being prepared, and blah blah. It's in I think it's the 5th trumpet, I want to say. Yeah, it is. Revelation 9, 7 through 11. These locusts then appear, and locusts biblically are also held, and not just in the Bible actually, but also elsewhere. But in the context of the Bible, locusts, other than actual real locusts, are also symbolic of demons, right?
Okay.
Of evil powers, and right. And so it's part of the reason for the plague of locusts in the Exodus. Anyway. The appearance of locusts was like horses prepared for battle, right? On their head, Revelation 9, verse 7. And on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold, and their faces were like the face of men. And they had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, of many horses running to battle. And they have tails like scorpions, and they sting. And in their tails is the power to hurt men for 5 months. Now, that seems unfathomably cryptic, and what on earth is this? And these things that have an appearance like locusts, so it's not actually saying they're literally locusts, but an appearance like locusts. They have crowns like gold. Again, like it, those heads appeared to have crowns like gold. The faces of men, but the hair of women. They have sharp teeth like lions, but they've also got breastplates on, so they're in military gear. What faces men? So what's it? this is the nature of this book, and this is why understanding not only the Old Testament, which illuminates it, because, by the way, it is called the book of Revelation. It's not called the book of super secrets, right? It's not called the book of hidden thing. It's a book of, it's apocalypsis in Greek means to reveal. You're meant to know it. It's not meant to hide it from you. It's actually meant to illuminate, right? It's actually, ironically, it's the opposite of the parables. Jesus' parables were largely meant to conceal as a judgment, because we can look at the parables, and we teach the parable all the time, and we learn it and we know it because of the death, burial, and resurrection and everything that's occurred. The parables have now been, we now understand what the parables mean. At the time, the parables were given as a judgment, not only against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but against all the Jews at the time who were blinded, right? Who through their own apostasy had blinded themselves. They didn't understand the Old Testament. They didn't recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. And so he purposefully spoke to them in parables as a judgment that you are blind men, leading blind men, and you're off to destruction. You will go as a result. This is meant to reveal. So then the question is, how do we know what this means? Apart from certain imagery in the Old Testament, like I mentioned, with locusts being associated with demons or demonic powers, knowing history, again, it's no coincidence at all, that there's actually a lot of historical information, including an eyewitness, mostly reputable, depending on what portion of his work you're talking about, in Josephus, right? Who was an eyewitness to these things. This is talking about the issue of transgenderism in the city at that time, during that last brutal 5 months, which is what happens. The war's kind of going on, the siege is going on for years, and then the zealots burn all the food supplies in the temple to force the people to fight, because it was fight or die, and that's where we get that's why the word zealot has come down through history. 5 months after that burning of the food grain, they had years of supplies. Jerusalem was a massive city that could have outlasted a siege for years and years and years. They burned the entire food supply, and 5 months later the Romans conquer the city. Well, this here says, and in their tales is the power to hurt men for, shock horror, 5 months, right? It's talking about the first century. So here's what happens. They have on their heads crowned like gold.
Was this written before this happened or after this happened?
We get back to the dating question, like with all the other things.
I'm just curious if he was actually
I've
prophesying or...
Oh no, I do. Well, I'm not the only one. I, along with the vast majority of theologians throughout the history of Christianity, argue for the pre-70 AD date. Again, there are other modern scholars who date it to the reign of Domitian in 95, 96, so about 25 years after the time. But that's a very novel invention. Like novel invention for those who say that the entire Old Testament was written in like the 6th century BC. Right? Okay, all right. No, all the internal evidence, I argue, points to John writing this in about basically the last year of Nero's reign, so it's kind of 67, 68.
Okay.
And with this being just on the heels. But there's a whole host of reasons for that. I'll give it very brief because then I'll explain this. The very brief answer is in Daniel, when you get to the end of the book of Daniel, he's told to seal up the book of prophets. Again, it's just Old Testament language, but seal up the prophecy for the time is not now, right? Because a lot of those things in those kind of chapters, 9, 10, 11, 12, they're talking about things that are going to unfold through the Hellenistic period, and then of course, the end of Daniel 9, the 70 weeks of Daniel thing, is talking about the coming of Christ, right? So it's not going to happen right now. It's going to unfold from his time period over basically the next half a millennium. John at the end is told not to seal up, and I'll read it for you, is told not to seal up this book.
Yeah, make it open.
For the time is almost at hand.
Okay.
Which is which is actually the defining argument, by the way. There's many others, but it's the defining argument. Seal. Yeah, so it's in Revelation 22, which is the last chapter. It's in verse 10. And this messenger of God, and he said to me, do not seal up the word of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. It's the same word, meaning at hand. It's right around the corner, right? So if Daniel's told to if Daniel is told to seal up the book for something 500 years later, why is John told to not seal up the book for something that, as certain Christians believe, we're still waiting for? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But if he's writing this while the war's going on and 2 years before a lot of this is to unfold in the destruction itself, barely 2 years away, then that makes way more sense of it being near. You know what I mean? That's
It's
the
just that
primary
it was
argument.
what you're showing is that the accuracy of the detail is so good. Did
Correct.
he know what was happening, or did he just?
No, this had not happened yet. This is a year and a half to 2 years away from when
So
when
he's
he writes
prophesying
this.
out
Oh
very
yes,
closely.
yes.
And accurately so.
Well, correct, and it's I'm saying it only seems cryptic if we're not familiar with the Old Testament or with the history from that time, right? So these locusts, these demonic creatures, right, being prepared for battle, on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold. Well, the Zealots and the Sicarii were the ones in charge. They were ruling Jerusalem, and many of them had fashioned crowns for themselves. Their faces like the face of men, because they were, but they had hair like women. But then Josephus records in his Jewish War, which was the primary eyewitness account of that thing, that many of the Zealots and the Sicarii were moving and living about the city as women, transgender, with wigs on, makeup, women's perfume, the whole box and dice, engaging in these brothels and orgies as women, the whole box and dice.
Right.
Their teeth were like the teeth of lions, right? So this image of ferocity. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron because they're all wearing. So it's women's wig, but they're wearing military gear. It's all because that's what they were. The Zealots and the Sicarii. They were fighters. There are many horses running to battle. They have tails like scorpions and stings, which sting. The same word used for tail there is the same word that's also used for sword in Greek.
Okay.
They sting, and that's what they would do. They would assassinate Romans. They would assassinate. Certainly, by the time you get to that 5-month period, the Zealots and the Sicarii are basically murdering anyone among the Jews who's not fighting. You don't want to fight? They just killed you right there and then. Because that's why that word zealotry has come into English. Yeah, because they were completely given over. So basically, what this is saying is these guys were demonically possessed.
Okay.
These are demons. It's not. They were so given over to evil. And anyone who reads Joseph, I covered this in part in church history. Not that I could go into full detail, but I did cover this in our church history classes. You'd be able to find it if you ever wanted to look more in detail. But that's a momentary time period. And it's even described in Revelation. But no, at no point has homosexuality been like would you say now where these various different sexual deviancies are exploding in popularity exponentially at this rate, which is like literally exponentially at this rate, no one would then look, in 500 years' time, no one's going to be able to conclude, homosexuality or transgenderism or whatever, or anything else that we get onto in the near future, that's a normal historic custom of Western civilization.
Right.
No one can conclude that. No, we're there now, but even 100 years ago we weren't there, let alone 200, let alone 500, let alone 1,000, right? All those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just say, Daniel, where it says where they hurt people for 5 months using their tails, where did you reference that back to? So you said...
It's a reference to their daggers, to their swords.
To their swords, and the 5 months?
So what happens is in 70 AD, so the war kicks off in 66,
Yeah.
right? The whole host of historical things. Again, I revisit my church history lessons on this if you want to. But in 70 AD, the Zealots and the Sicarii, particularly the Zealots, and there were different factions among them, warring against each other for power. While they're fighting the Romans, they're also fighting a civil war against each other. But anyway, one of the factions of the Zealots burns Jerusalem's entire grain supply, their food supply. It's almost exactly 5 months later that eventually the city succumbs to the Roman assault on the third interior wall, and then Rome burns Jerusalem to the ground. Yeah. So that's why, a lot of the eschatological guesswork of trying to predict what this future event and gets thrown out the window when you just realise that this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's talking in the future because it is future to John by a couple of years. It's not future to us. Not every single I don't mean every single port, because there are things in Revelation which reference the second coming, right? I'm talking about these kinds of things. I'm talking about the bulk of it. The vast majority, again, the on the whole, the book of Revelation is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. not exclusively, because the first 3 chapters don't.
No.
Chapters 1, 2, and 3 are, well, chapters 1 is a introduction and a vision, and then chapters 2 and 3 are individual letters being addressed to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. But the whole book is addressed to them also. That's the other part too, by the way, is that if chapters 4 and following are talking about things in the future also to us, then why on earth does John basically fundamentally waste his time writing this entire letter to a group of 7 churches who have nothing to do with what happens in chapter 4 and following?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't make any. We wouldn't treat anything else. It'd be like looking at the book of Galatians and saying, well, I know it's written to the Galatians. It really actually had nothing to do with them. It was actually writing only to us. Well, no one draws that conclusion, and not for obvious reasons. Yeah. Again, that's a divided opinion among Christians.
It is.
Which is
Very
fine, but Christians can very much coexist while having different views on that.
It's not a salvation
It's
killer.
not a self, no, exactly.
Certainly not in the broader sense. No, there'd be some. If you went way down the rabbit hole, there'd be some conclusions that you can draw that would definitely not just verge on heresy, but basically get there. But that's if you take them to their full logical extent. But yeah, the issue really is not so much differences of views. The issue, as I like to say as politely as I can, is who's right. I guess that would go about anything. And it doesn't mean that someone's entirely right. Someone could also be partly wrong. At the end of the day, though, actually, there's a very good point to jump off. Like I almost began some of our discussions with today. The reality is that if one's opinion or belief or viewpoint about a given subject doesn't stand up to scrutiny or questioning, it's probably because you're wrong, right? There's nothing, and that's okay. The question is not whether we're wrong. Ultimately, the question is, are we humble enough to correct ourselves when we're wrong?
That's the hard part.
And that's the hard part. Plenty of issues I've changed views on, not out of a personal desire, but out of realizing that a previous concept that I held to was incorrect, and that if I actually claim to faithfully follow the one who's called the way, the truth, and the life, then the truth doesn't submit to me, but I need to submit to the truth.
Yeah. That's,
And that's a good principle to go by for anyone. So.